Good day, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this morning. This is Laurie Mahon. I'm a special advisor to Vauban Infrastructure, and Vauban is happy to invite you to a dialogue over the next few months on the future of cities and infrastructure in urban areas. We've put together an amazing program over the next couple of months, and I think the best one is the first one, which is today. We will take the next 2 hours and we will talk to 3 leading lights in the European community who have made cities their lives and their livelihood. And we will get their perspective on everything from the social network within cities and how important it is, down to the basic nitty-gritty of transportation and energy. And then we will have a fascinating overview of how European Union policy is really driving decisions at the urban level and how all of that comes together. I'm really thrilled to have been invited to do this. I have been involved in cities my entire life. I grew up in a city, but most importantly, I've been working and studying cities for more than 50 years. I have a master's degree from Harvard University in urban planning. I've also been a journalist. I've been a government official. I ran a transit agency. I've been a consultant. I've been a banker. I've been an investment banker. I've been a developer. I've been a contractor. And I've been a board member of a number of infrastructure companies. I like to say there aren't enough seats at the table for all of the ones that I've sat in. So that means I'm usually standing in the corner shouting at people. I hope to do no shouting today, except in affirmation of some great ideas. A little bit more about our think tank, and excuse me for reading this part, but I want to get it right because it's quite important. Our think tank is really to foster a fruitful discussion between all the infra shareholders and stakeholders, asset operators, investors, experts, startups, policymakers, pundits, looking at hot topics in infrastructure. This year's theme in 2025 is, as I said, Cities of Tomorrow, Reimagining Urban Infrastructure. But in the past, this group has also looked at other tenets of infrastructure, particularly inclusive infrastructure, and that theme carries on as well. Today's discussion is going to focus on our work theme 1, which is really looking at the next 10 years as the foundational decade for being able to make cities better agglomerations for future growth and future human satisfaction in life. We've got to lay a solid foundation to build a good building, and we're going to talk about that, both the successes and the failures. As we move forward into the year, our other themes, which I won't really spend much time on today, are going to be future-proofing and then ultimately governance. Very important. I live in the United States. I don't want to talk about governance today, believe me. But as we gather today, I said it's the beginning of this discussion. We will not only have these webinars, but there will be other opportunities to get together. So please stay tuned to LinkedIn. Please stay tuned to however you get your news and participate as you go along. And at the end of the study period, there will be a live session to unveil the paper in November. So with that, let me introduce all 3 of our speakers initially, and then I will turn it over to our first speaker. So we are very blessed today to have with us Elisa Ferreira, who just told me she lives in the lovely city of Porto in Lisbon, so I'm quite jealous of that. She has had a distinguished career both in Portugal and in Europe in politics, dating back, I won't say how many years. You can guess for yourself. She has been around for a long time, which is a good thing. One of the things you learn when you study cities is that history matters. And so it's not just geographic time history, but history of individuals. You know, how many different iterations has someone seen? Because this is an ever evolving discussion as generations change, as needs of citizens change. Elisa has had to deal with this both in Portugal and as a member of the member of the European Parliament, and she has been quite focused on the EU's cohesion policy, and she's going to talk to us about that today. Joanne Anderson, she tells me I can call her the good Jo, was a former mayor of Liverpool who's been very active throughout her entire career in looking at cities not just as an agglomeration of buildings, but as a place where people need to have their needs met and where social equity is increasingly important. She is currently well known as a consultant, and is also a professor. And she will tell us a little bit about herself and how she got involved in doing all of this when she begins to speak. I have the pleasure of leading a fireside chat with her later on, and I look forward to that very much. Andy Karvonen is our numbers guy. He's going to give us all kinds of good data. I looked through it all, and it's quite intense. So get your pens and papers ready to ask a lot of questions. He is a professor of urban design and planning at Lund University in Sweden, but he did his PhD at the University of Texas. So I might have to pull him aside and ask him some questions about the U.S. He's held a number of positions throughout Europe, including the University of Manchester. And he focuses his research on sustainable cities and the interaction among technology, people, and the environment. And with that, I would like to introduce Elisa to give us about 15 minutes. And we will then follow that with a Q&A with the audience of about 15 minutes before we then talk to Andy. So with that, Elisa, all yours.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Gwen. And thank you very much for the introduction. And in fact, until now, I'm a university teacher, which I've been from long ago as well. But in the meantime, I just finished for 5 years being in charge of cohesion policy in Europe. And because I was commissioner for cohesion and reforms. I also served for 6 years as minister with António Guterres, for 4 years Minister of Environment, then Minister of Regional Development, and apart from that, of course, I was also doing a little bit in the financial sector and I was Vice Governor of the Central Bank of Portugal for 3 years as well. But I'm an economist. I had my PhD in the United Kingdom. And I have, my master's degree exactly on regional development. And what I would like to bring today to our discussion is a kind of complementary view to the other speakers, in the sense that they know the business from a city point of view. And I was trying to focus on a little bit on the environment, on what we can expect from cities, and what is the impact of cities in surrounding areas, and what is the impact of these surrounding areas of countries on cities. And I'm bringing forward the experience of visiting all the members of the European Union during these 5 years, and in particular the regions where there are more serious problems. I'll be depending on support, and I thank you for that, of moving the slides. And the first one, not this one, the previous one, is the role of cities, urban areas. What do they display? We are in a phase in which we are trying to stimulate growth in the European Union and competitiveness. Cities are the place where we have the most dynamic, sophisticated concentration of industries, of financial services, of infrastructures, research. So we expect these cities to be the engine for growth in Europe. But can they be just like that, the engines? Can we rely on them? This is the question that I'm trying to answer when I ask, can cities be the engine of European competitiveness? And having said this, I think it is important to note that these cities, in fact, they don't live in a vacuum. They influence, and they are influenced by the countries, by the regions where they are located, and we have expectations about the role they play, not only as drivers of competitiveness, but also as beacons for new ways to manage energy, for also retaining population in places that are losing it. And from that perspective, it is very important to note that certain cities are affected in their performance by climate, by aging, by internal imbalances, by internal and external migrations, and sometimes they can do very little about how to manage, how to access these trends that come and transform them and change them. And so each case, each city is a city, but there is in fact a lot of work to be done in relation to the details of what's surrounding the cities. Now you have a map. The map has two sides. The left side is the regions that are lagging behind in Europe. So the pinker or the pinkest regions are the poorest, and the green ones are the most dynamic. It's a picture in which you see east and west and south, a lot of development problems. And the stronger the color, the lower is the GDP per capita level. On the right side, however, you have the rates of growth of GDP. So the dynamism that it embodied in these regions. And you see that even if we see east and west, the same pattern when we look at the first map. On the second one, we see that, yes, in the east of Europe and in the north of Europe, things are moving fast, even if they have not yet reached the level that they will eventually reach later on. But in fact, the dynamic is completely different. And this dynamic reflects, obviously, on the role of cities in the different territories. And now I move into another map in which you see red colors and orange colors. And this is another image of another side of the same problem. So the red areas, they have lost a lot of young, dynamic population. And the orange ones are the ones that are losing population. So all these cities in these areas, if we want to counter this trend and this exhaustion of young people that can really move forward and retain the energy of these regions, they have got to do a lot of work, but they have to know where they stand because they have been losing population for a long time. And now we see another pattern, and I go back to sentences, to words, but in fact, it seems there is a kind of different pattern of cities in eastern and northern regions that are catching up, that are growing at high growth rates. But on the other hand, there are several southern regions that are persistently in a development trap. And some of these regions are losing their best human resources that could help them to move actually forward and to get out of this development trap and this human capacity trap. So how are cities? What is the role that cities can play? How can cities control these mechanisms? Probably they cannot do everything by themselves, but you see a different pattern of cities if you look north, east, or west. And this, I find it interesting, and I wanted to share with you. So the kind of strategy, the infrastructures that you need to put in a city are probably different. But another important aspect is to note that in these areas with development problems in the south and in some, not all countries in the east, you see a big metropolitan region or area or city, a big conurbation, and then you see a lot of emptiness in the surrounding territories. And if you remember what we saw in the previous slides, the one that has pink and green, you can tell that in fact people that don't find a way of life, they tend to move, particularly in south and in certain countries of the east, they tend to move to the big city, to the big metropolitan area, trying to look, and you see all these dots, little dots, brown and yellowish. And this shows exactly that in the north and in the most developed areas of Europe, that is the central and Nordic area, you see a lot of interesting urban centers, whereas in the south and the east and some countries in the east, you tend to have a kind of hyper concentration in big urban areas. Now you have another chart or a table that is, it seems more difficult to read, but it's quite okay if you take the second layer, the second group of information is Eastern member states. So here you have the growth in the first column of GDP per head, then the productivity, and then employment. And in a nutshell, what you see here is that whereas in Eastern member states, you have sustainable and strong growth in the last 20 years in capital metro regions, that the first layer, other metro regions, and non-metro regions, you see in southern member states, you see that in particular productivity has been negative on average in the last years, and particularly negative when it concerns to the performance of capital metro regions. So the big engines supposedly capable of bringing the whole country together and making it grow, in fact, are performing negatively. So this calls for an attention, a special attention on the cases where you have these economies of agglomeration, and this is correlated, or there is a suspicion of a correlation with the lack of capacity to get out of this development trap in certain economies. Now you have an evolution of total employment. So there is the other chart with a red, blue, and a green line. And you can see this is the attraction of population. So evolution of total employment in metro and non-metro regions. And you see that capital metro regions have been growing extremely fast. So there is an influence here of the presence and of the weight of these southern and some eastern countries. The blue line shows other metro regions, metropolitan regions. And in fact, you have the green line for relating to non-metro regions. So the metro regions, the big conurbations, are going extremely fast, growing very, very fast. But this is followed, and this is the other chart that says changes in GDP. This growth of these metropolitan regions is done by increasing the population, but not increasing the competitiveness, because you have predominantly urban areas are losing power. And you see in the changes in GDP per head in new regions, you see rural and urban. And the ones that are in fact increasing their productivity are basically the rural areas, but close to cities. So this calls one's attention to the fact that these areas that are not in fact suffering yet from the strong costs of agglomeration, where it is impossible, the cost of real estate, the cost of transport, the cost of education, the exhaustion of public services is limiting their capacity to grow. So it is essential, and this is in fact something that calls the attention of a lot of member states, particularly in countries where one big pole is dominant, mostly in Southern Europe, where you don't have alternative development poles. Often you have internally a lot of poverty, a lot of people that are displaced, and they go on coming to the big city because in the places where they locate, aging is very strong. Climate problems, fires, forest fires, floods are really a serious issue. And so they come in search of a better life in city, which often they can't find. So what kind of conclusions can you drag from here? That in fact, it is essential, and here I just give you a hint on total expenditure on research and development, which is a chart with a lot of little dots, brown dots, and orange kind of dots. You see that capital regions in the most dynamic developed countries, capital regions are not necessarily, if you start with the first line, Sweden, Denmark, Belgium, I mean, you go here and you see that the capital region is sharing this impulse, this capacity to bring the economy together into new areas of competitiveness. Uh, I mean, in a more mixed kind of layout, combined with other cities, smaller cities, that also have their role in research, in development, and this is associated with this sustainable growth. Whereas in the less developed economies, and you see on the right part of the chart, you have a low level, of course, of research and development investment. But on the other hand, everything is concentrated in the most important city, that usually is the capital city. Of course, working in a network seems to be a solution, but having in mind the first charter that we saw with those colors, you can imagine, and here I conclude, you can identify that investment cannot only occur in very sophisticated cities and big metropolis. It has got also to look at creating the conditions in the less developed areas of Europe for location, attraction of people, retention of people in those areas, combining a multipolar kind of approach to this concern of creating poles that can provide to the surrounding areas good quality of life and retain population and companies and economic activities. In the next slide, you have motorways and major roads. So this gives you a broad idea of how intense the network of basic infrastructures is in the center of Europe, but also in some of these southern and western countries, but how much there is still to do in the eastern part of Europe. So when you are talking about the infrastructures, if we want to retain the population and to make these countries grow in a more sustainable way, you need to go on investing in this kind of basic infrastructures. I show roads, but if I show supply of clean water, if I show every other, I mean, basic infrastructures, there is a lot of investment to be done. And even in speed trains, you see that the network, and this is the next slide, in which you see a lot of lines. These lines show how much imbalanced also the speed train, which is essential, is. The last comment is that, in fact, across you, basic infrastructures is still needed, but the kind of infrastructures that you have to concentrate on varies. Small cities, medium cities, and big cities require, of course, different kinds of investment, and a particular note to the expectations that we have that by solving their big problems of congestion, also in IA, in traffic management, in new building techniques, in urban energy saving and management, in the management of public transports, that big cities manage to use new technology and a more environmental friendly approach in order to become beacons and inspiration for others. But to finalize, cohesion policy is the European policy that is supporting all these investments, because if you think of a highway, if you think of a sustainable system of water supply, it will take decades until a normal country, and in particular a poor country, to recover and to have the capacity of investment. So cohesion policy is in fact the glue that is keeping Europe together and rebalancing growth. But there is also responsibility on how to use these funds by member states, by regions, and by cities. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I took 2 minutes more than my allocated time.
That's quite all right. It was very interesting. I'm hoping we have some questions from the audience in a minute. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to see those, but I guess I will. But why don't I start? Why don't I start with a question to get things rolling? And that is, if, as I said, I'm a student of history of cities, and back in the day, going back many thousands of years, cities really formed at nodality points, right? At the points where there was a port, at the point where two civilizations connected. And it formed for the purposes of trade, for commerce, and for communication. But as we move into a 21st century where communication really trumps all, we can have this call today from multiple countries. We're not in the same place, and we're able to share things in real time. What is it that drives the formation and growth of either new cities or agglomeration of bigger cities, if it is not physically needing to be close to each other for trade and physically coming together to kind of talk to each other? What are the drivers of the 21st century city growth?
I think the most there are several reasons for the growth of cities. Cities are supposed to be beacons and the most capable centers of interpreting what we want to move forward. In fact, we expect these cities to be strong, to be flexible, to be efficient, to be capable of interpreting our concerns about climate, about energy, about the best way, the most technologically advanced way to manage traffic. So we expect this, but sometimes what cities are faced with, and this varies across Europe and across the different models of development of different countries, but what we are seeing in a lot of cities is that they are faced with very basic needs, such as housing, supplying housing, supplying transport, supplying health services. And this doesn't allow these cities to develop everything that with their institutions, with their universities, with their financial sector, they should be able to deliver. So technology has got to be applied in the sense of minimizing the diseconomies of scale of hyperagglomeration, but at the same time, and this calls for an attention to the cities, not only by the cities themselves, but by the member states or by Europe, you need to have alternative poles. Because if you don't have alternative poles that retain the population in other places in the country, these people will migrate internally, they will concentrate on the big city, and from there they will move forward, probably, going to other countries. And there is a sense of loss. Not that people should not move, they should move, but they should exchange. Some people come, some people go. What is happening now in certain places in Europe, and it is not only some places in France, some places in Spain, and a lot of places in the eastern countries, is that there are places that become absolutely empty with just old people. And these old people, of course, they don't have the energy. So all the potential that is lying there, with the environmental potential, all the agriculture potential, forestry, tends to disappear, to be abandoned. And they are very often the victims, or they suffer from forest fires, and these areas become kind of pockets of cost instead of contributing to the growth and to the dynamism of the country. So rebalancing growth requires a lot of intelligence, also from the point of view of the cities, but not only from the cities, also from the central governments and from the European, I think, the European policies, in order to create a more balanced approach. And I think a lot of countries, and the graphs, I think, show it, a lot of areas, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Sweden, the northern countries, they have a more balanced approach to growth. And so they create multipolar networks that together are much more resilient than what is the model of development that is instinctively followed apparently by certain other countries.
We do have one question from the audience. Thank you, whoever sent that in, which is, if you look at the menu of choices that the EU has with regard to policies around climate change and resiliency, how would you prioritize those? What are the things you think are will have the biggest impact on making cities more resilient to climate change?
Well, in my opinion, adapting to climate change, doing preventive measures and doing proactive measures to control the problem that is evident in our eyes is not really a matter of discussion or a choice. It's something that we have to do, and cities can play a major role. So what we tried to do with also this cohesion policy is to create a kind of a win-win situation. The renovation wave that we launched was an example of this. So all the buildings in cities, all the management of traffic, all the green areas, all the capacity to retain water, not to overuse water, not to destroy the quality of water. All this is absolutely essential. And big cities, they have a major contribution to climate change. So whatever different cities can do in that sense it has got to be shared. We also created a lot of specific, just kind of, it's not really a fund. It's really a kind of a show of what can be done. So we have urban activities, urban instruments, innovation in urban areas, and we tried during this mandate to create meetings among urban areas in order to discuss and to exchange good practices, because there is so much. And I have great expectations to the next speakers, because exactly
Yes.
they can illustrate what can be done. And cities are beacons. Even if the big cities have the knowledge, the capacity to do this, I think if we communicate, if you create networks, all this information, how to do it, how to achieve our targets, can be shared and adapted by other smaller cities that often don't have the means or the capacity to assume risks of testing new technologies and new methodologies. I've
I
seen
think
it
so. And I
being
do
done
too.
all across Europe.
At the end of this, everyone remember that the speakers will all get a go at each other. So I see Andy kind of chomping at the bit there, but he's going to have to wait his turn. I have a provocative question for you, and it comes from me, not the audience, which is, if you were to put on your future-looking glasses and think about all of what's happening in Europe, the flooding, the extreme weather conditions, the need to start thinking about retrofitting buildings in cities that never used to get warm to deal with human life. Do you think that the pattern of megacities in Europe will look the same 100 years from now as what it looks now? Do you think that we are ever going to reach a policy goal where we're going to say we are not going to rebuild that city? We are going to focus on living in better places, more adapted to climate? Or do you think the politics will make it so difficult that we will continue to invest in places that perhaps that investment becomes riskier and riskier over time?
Well,
And you get 3 minutes to answer that term paper question.
It's very difficult to guess what the future will bring. Even what happened.
Well said, Madam Politician. But give me your academic answer.
What happened in the world in the recent 2 years is so amazing. Since COVID, I think everything is so you cannot anticipate. But what we can do, and we cannot avoid this, is to do whatever we can to contain damages and losses of life and the accelerated destruction of the planet. This calls for a much more careful way of thinking and programming things. I think over agglomerations are absolutely negative for the quality of people, quality of life of people, for the environment, and for the management of infrastructures and of public services. So I think rebalancing growth and giving another look at how medium-sized cities and even small villages, the role they can play in retaining population and offering this population a good quality internet, good quality services is essential, provided that people don't feel isolated.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to change our paradigm, but I think more and more young people, and this is a source of hope, are attentive to environment, are attentive to these issues. The problem sometimes is that you say something, but then when it comes to the actual decision, I mean, the pressure on mayors, on the pressure on the political agents doesn't allow for things that are more long term and
Mm-hmm.
less, I mean, visible in the short, immediate term.
I think that's very well said. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your insights and your knowledge with us. And we'll get another bite at the apple at the end of this when we'll invite you all to carry on a conversation. Andy, I think she couldn't have teed this up better for you. And you can help us understand some of the actual dynamics that are driving transformative infrastructure in the next century. Amazingly enough, leading off with climate. The screen is yours.
Okay, thank you, Laurie, and thank you to Eliza for the introductory keynote. Hopefully, I can add some flavor to that, a different dimension to that. My name's Andy Karvonen. I'm from Lund University, and I'm an urban planner and a social scientist. And I'm interested in how technology and people co-evolve in cities. So I'm particularly interested in infrastructure systems, which we're talking about today, and how they support, how they connect up to urban development. So I've done projects on water and on energy and on housing. And more recently, I've been focusing on smart cities, digitalization, artificial intelligence in cities. And I'm also interested in situated spaces of innovation. So we hear a lot about urban laboratories and urban experiments, test beds, innovation districts. How are they changing cities? How are they changing infrastructure services? And infrastructure is amazing because it really provided stability for cities in the 20th century, both in Europe as well as around the globe. But we're now entering very disruptive times. I think we all know about that economically, politically, climate-wise, ecologically, digitalization, social division. All of these things are disrupting cities and they're disrupting infrastructures. So I want to quickly talk about 3 different cases of disruption in urban infrastructure. So one is about climate, one is about energy, and one is about mobility. And the key question that I want to ask is, how can we adapt and upgrade existing urban infrastructures in this age of disruption? Maybe another way to say it is, how do we need to change infrastructure services in cities to be fit for purpose for the 21st century? So let me start with the first one, climate. When we think about climate in cities, we often think about flooding. We often think about wildfires. But one of the things maybe we don't think about enough is temperature, and specifically high temperatures in summer months. One indicator of high temperatures is temperature anomalies. So you can see this graph on the left side of the screen. We've got some record-setting years in 2023 and 2024, and 1.5 degrees Celsius might not seem like very much, but it's an indicator of these large temperature extremes that we're going through in cities more increasingly every year. Those of us in Europe will remember August of 2003 when 70,000 people died because of a heat wave, particularly in France. That was the epicenter of the heat wave. But this was a wake-up signal that we need to manage for a hotter and more deadly future. 20 years later, we have record-breaking heat waves. They're the norm in Europe and around the world, and they're characterized as a silent killer. These hotter conditions are here to stay, and we need to think about what we can do about it. So what does this have to do with cities? Well, probably all of us have heard about the urban heat island effect. The built environment exacerbates high temperatures because of lack of vegetation, because of built-up constructed surfaces. It can be 5 to 10 degrees warmer in cities than it is in the surrounding countryside. So cities become this death trap during heat waves. So how do we respond to that? Well, if you go back to 2003 and the heat wave in Europe, people bought air conditioners. This was a quick fix. It helped people in the short term, but it had a lot of negative consequences. It strained electricity networks. It's expensive to operate. It produced heat and noise. It produced carbon emissions. Some countries even mandated air conditioning for hospitals and nursing homes, which is probably a good thing, but it's not really a long-term solution to high temperatures in cities during the summer. So we need to think more broadly. So if we think from an urban planning perspective, we can see that there are different strategic ways to address heat. Lots of activities are happening in hot cities, think places like Phoenix and Tokyo and Athens, but also in colder climates. Here in the Nordic countries where I am, they're also talking about heat planning. And they talk about two different things: mitigation strategies and management strategies. And mitigation strategies are about retrofitting the built environment to make it more resilient to higher temperatures. So shade structures and cool pavements, building orientation, green roofs and walls, water features, and so on. And then there are management strategies. So developing approaches so that urban residents can cope with these hotter conditions. So this is about reinforcing energy grids so that they work in higher temperatures, minimizing personal exposure. If you think about construction workers who are outside all day, they're very exposed to these high temperatures. Training healthcare professionals so they can treat people with heat wave diseases. Providing spaces where people can cool down during heat waves. So a couple of brief examples. Singapore has rapidly emerged as an exemplar of green urbanism. They're making these huge investments in nature-based solutions. They're retrofitting buildings, they're retrofitting streets, and they're maximizing shade and wind. These are costly, these are disruptive, but they're going to have long-term benefits for Singapore as a city, Singapore as a nation. The idea here is that cities need to act more like forests and moderate temperatures for human beings. So it's not an emphasis so much on increasing biodiversity, which is also a benefit of this, but it's really about making cities more livable and habitable for humans. And this isn't something new in Singapore or anywhere else, but we're recognizing now that urban nature is a necessity rather than just something that's nice to have or luxury. And we're starting to see these really strong connections between human health and biodiversity, economic development, and even global reputation. Second example, this one's more about urban heat management. So this is Barcelona. They have a network of climate shelters there. So they repurpose 350 indoor and outdoor spaces, including parks and libraries, churches, schools, recreation areas, shopping malls. And these are places where residents can go during heat waves. And the idea is that they want to have a climate shelter where someone can walk there within 5 minutes by 2030. Many other cities have started to develop these approaches. We can think of them like bomb shelters or other disaster relief facilities for storms and floods and fires. And we see that Coolth is a resource that needs to be available to everyone. Some of the big challenges here, we need to know where these cooling shelters are. Maybe there's apps. Not everybody has a mobile phone. Maybe there's information campaigns on TV with paper put in the mail. But not everybody can access these spaces either. So we need to think about that. But the idea is you develop this social infrastructure that can help in times of high temperature. One of the big challenges of urban heat is who's responsible for the heat agenda? Who can connect up the various departments at the local government to create a comprehensive strategy? Heat is notorious for not having a problem owner. Instead, it cuts across multiple departments, and so it suggests that we need new joined up ideas about local government. In 2021, Miami-Dade County in Florida announced the first chief heat officer. We've now seen this in other cities, Phoenix and Athens, Freetown and Sierra Leone, and Los Angeles. But this is an individual who is tasked with coordinating the heat agenda across multiple different departments. So we're starting to see a lot of new ways that we're trying to plan given climate changes. So that's climate. Let's move on to energy. So this is a second example of infrastructure disruption. I'm going to focus specifically on renewable energy technologies and how they're reorganizing how we generate, how we transmit, and how we consume energy. I think we all know about photovoltaics and the huge generation that the huge market impacts that they've had over the last decade. We can see this on this graph that in China it's been particularly pronounced, but we can also see it in other parts of the world. They're cheaper photovoltaic panels, they're becoming much more efficient, and this dream of solar energy that began in the 60s and 70s is now becoming a reality. There's still some issues with storing energy when the sun's not shining, but battery technologies are improving every day. A second technology, heat pumps. This is another disruptive renewable energy technology. Similar growth to photovoltaics over the last decade, and this is certainly a good thing. But it's interesting to think about what does this mean for urban infrastructure? How does this change the way that cities function? Both these cases of photovoltaics and heat pumps are about these are localized site-specific technologies. Can we figure out ways to make these feed into the grid? And create this sort of distributed system of energy generation? Or are each of us expected to have our own individual strategy for energy generation? And is that even feasible? So in Europe, since 2018, the European Union has been promoting positive energy districts in neighborhoods. And the idea is that you divide up cities into specific districts or neighborhoods, and then you develop strategies for energy generation, energy storage, and energy use, and maybe even energy export. So it's driven by three principles you can see on the left side of the screen. You generate energy with renewable technologies, then you use that as efficiently as possible in buildings, and then you try to create energy flexibility with storage, with sharing options, and you combine these different strategies together to create a local energy system. So an example of this would be you have a building, you have photovoltaics on the roof, you also super insulate the building and have high efficiency appliances inside. And then maybe you have a battery system in the basement that stores the excess energy for later use. You might also be able to power vehicles with that battery. You could also share on a microgrid system with other buildings. There's questions about whether positive energy districts are actually possible. Can we actually export energy from a neighborhood, or would we consume it all? But the EU is very positive about this. They think that we can create 100 positive energy districts by the end of this year, and then it will just continue to grow in the coming decades. I recently completed a project called TransPed, and this was about transforming cities through positive energy districts. And we had 5 different positive energy districts across Europe, 2 in Sweden, 2 in Belgium, and 2 in Austria. And we were interested in the governance aspects of positive energy districts more than the technical aspects of that. But 4 different things, 4 different recommendations that we came out with. Number 1, we think that leadership is key. Appointing an organization that can connect up the different stakeholders in the positive energy district is essential. This lead organization can be from the public sector, can be from the private sector, can be from the third sector, but they're the champion of the district and they bring together all the key players. In Stockholm, the PED, the champion was a nonprofit organization. In Brussels, it was a private company. So there's different ways to do it. Second, there needs to be a shared vision. So the stakeholders and the leader need to develop a narrative that highlights the unique attributes of the district. It's not necessarily about energy. So in Brussels, the abattoir district is a former slaughterhouse, and it's now being positioned as a food hub. They call it the belly of Brussels. People can remember that, right? And in the positive energy district in Lund, where I live, there are 2 major scientific facilities there, and they're promoting Brunshaug as a testbed of sustainable living. So there's different narratives that they use. The third finding that we found was that they need to integrate all these different energy interventions into a coherent whole. So it's really about thinking about the trade-offs, the synergies that you can find between these different technologies. In several of the PEDs that we worked on, the buildings are all required to connect up to the existing district heating network, which is a good thing. but they are also proposing super insulated buildings that don't actually require district heating. So you have to start thinking about the trade-offs. Do you connect to district heating? Do you not connect to district heating? Another example, roof space. Do you use roof space for photovoltaics? Do you use it for urban agriculture? Do you use it for a social meeting place, a courtyard or something like that? So you need to make some tough choices about that. And we start to see energy planning come together with urban planning in really interesting ways. And then finally, it's about learning. It's creating this evidence base to assess the outcomes and inform next steps on what you're going to do in the innovation journey. So it's this key task of documenting what's happened, what's the performance of that. You can keep track of this and you can reflect on them with the stakeholders. You can create this community of interest and you can ultimately use that in other places. So a big challenge of positive energy districts is, how do you scale up? The focus on the district scale is great because you have this concentrated place where you can focus your energy. But how do you go beyond the district boundaries? So we need to think about how can we get individuals, how can we get organizations that can take the findings from positive energy districts and embed those in regulations and policies and incentives and transfer the learnings from one district to another district. And then my final example is mobility. Today, we're talking a lot about autonomous vehicles. This is going to be a major innovation. Potentially, it's going to be the biggest revolution since the introduction of automobiles over a century ago. There's different predictions on autonomous vehicles and when they're actually going to happen. They're on the road today, but they're just in a testing phase. Some say next 15 or 20 years, they're going to become very commonplace. Others say, no, it's going to take four to 6 decades. So it could be a long time. During this period, there's going to be a lot of chaos. Now's a good time to move out of cities, move to the countryside, wait for all this chaos to settle down. But there's going to be shifting regulations. There's going to be shifting norms. There's going to be autonomous vehicles. There's going to be conventional vehicles. It's going to be crazy. There's supposed to be a lot of advantages of autonomous vehicles: safety, reduced traffic congestion, lower vehicle emissions, potentially cheaper mobility services, greater access for people who can't drive, so children or seniors or those with disabilities. But it really depends on how this technology is implemented. So here's a very simplistic way to think about 2 pathways for autonomous vehicles. One is driven by private companies, the other is driven by public authorities. It's really just meant to have us start thinking about and debating about autonomous vehicles and the positive and negative aspects of them. So on the autocentric, on the left side, autonomous vehicles could potentially amplify urban sprawl. They make it easier to live far from the city center. You could have meetings or watch a movie while you're driving from your house 2 hours away to work down in the city center. Then your car circles around for 8 hours until you're done with work, and then it takes you back home. The car remains the center stage, and it's privately owned. We don't need mass transit anymore because everybody's got their own autonomous vehicle or their family owns an autonomous vehicle. We maximize profits for companies, but that doesn't do much for the public realm. It doesn't do much for society. On the right-hand side, we have a human-centric idea of rolling out autonomous vehicles. This is where autonomous vehicles are regulated by public authorities to maximize the public good. There's an idea of sharing vehicles. We might think about Uber, but with autonomous vehicles. And we use vehicles much more intensively. We integrate them with public transit. They could provide last-mile service after you jump off a train or off a bus. They could complement active mobility, cycling and walking, and they could allow us to create denser human-centered developments. So a fundamental question is, autonomous vehicles are this amazing technological solution, but what's the social problem that we're trying to address here? Is it human driving errors? Is it urban sprawl? Is it the challenge of finding a parking space in a congested city? Is it a lack of mobility options for non-drivers? There's lots of different things to think about. But from an urban planning perspective, we can really see autonomous vehicles as an opportunity to rethink streets, really thinking about the public realm, making them less auto-dominated and enhancing social cohesion, social interaction. We can remove on-street and off-street parking. We don't need car parking, so in close proximity to human activities, so it frees up space for other uses. Could be dining, could be urban infrastructure or ecological infrastructure, could be a lot of different things. Driving lanes, they can be narrower. We can make room for walking. We can make room for cycling. We can start to reappropriate the rights of way for urban residents rather than for automobiles. We can potentially create calmer, more consistent speeds in highly populated areas, more safe. And then create this mass transit seamless journey where we use autonomous vehicles for the last mile. A big challenge of autonomous vehicles is how do we maximize the benefits and how do we minimize the drawbacks of this disruptive technology? We didn't do a very good job 100 years ago when automobiles were introduced. Are there ways that we can be more proactive? Are there ways that we can be more thoughtful when we think about autonomous vehicles? There are lots of different approaches we can take to forecasting, where we can anticipate the implications of technological developments and implement regulations to steer things like autonomous vehicles towards societal ends. But it's difficult to keep pace with technological innovation. It keeps racing forward on a daily basis. And developing policies, developing regulations takes a long time. At the moment, autonomous vehicles are not really on the radar of urban planners, but they really need to be, I think, very soon. So to conclude, there's a quote there at the bottom by Michael Batty. He's a very influential urban thinker. He says that we're at the start of an inventive century and a disruptive one. Of that, there can be little doubt. And I think this is really important when we think about urban infrastructures and the challenges that they are bringing with climate change, with digitalization, with shifting life and work patterns, and so on. And I think this is very evident in my examples of heat and positive energy districts and autonomous vehicles. So I think this is an opportunity for us to rethink infrastructures, to rethink collective services, and steer them towards more sustainable and livable conditions in the future. Thank you.
Excellent, Andy. A lot of information in a very short period of time, which leads to some interesting questions. The first is from the audience, and I'm going to add on a second piece to it. You described what's going on in Barcelona and Singapore, two of probably the most prosperous cities in the world. And the question becomes, is this a first world solution? How do we bring this into the third world? How do we bring this into developing economies? It's incredibly expensive to do many of these things. How do you monetize it is my question as the banker. And then I'm going to overlay something else to really see how good you are, because I think I know the answer, is that it also seems to work best in cities that have abundant water. And I think one of the things you didn't touch on that I personally feel we don't talk enough about when we talk about cities is water, whether it's rising waters, falling waters, or lack of water, distribution of water, all of that. And many of the solutions to cooling involve water. But if you're in a place that doesn't have water, how do you address it? So you've got 10 minutes to answer that one question, because I think it's got every question in the books in there.
Great. Multiple questions here. This is great. So we're focusing here on heat and the high temperatures and what to do with that. Is it just a first world solutions that we can find? I would say no. I mean, well, first of all, this is happening all over the world, and I think even in the global north, even in Europe, we have highly differential landscape of heat impacts. So even in a city in Sweden, which we would think, okay, how could that have any heat impacts? We have neighborhoods that are highly impacted by heat and other ones that are lowly impacted by heat. So is there a way to monetize that? I think that's a huge challenge. I think that we don't really have a way to find a way for companies to make a profit off of providing
or even to pay for it, to find the source of revenue. I mean, Barcelona and Singapore are wealthy cities, and you think about other cities that are not wealthy cities, how do they pay for this kind of much needed investment, I think is really a better statement of the question.
Yeah. I'm not an economist, so I don't know if I have a good answer for that. But I mean, I think there are smaller measures that you can make. I mean, creating shade in cities, taking out hard surfaces and planting trees. You know, that doesn't necessarily have to be a lot of capital investment to do that.
If you have the
Um,
water to keep the trees alive.
if you have the water to keep the trees alive. This goes back to your question to Eliza earlier about, are there cities where we're going to have to pull back? Are there cities that we're going to, potentially going to have to abandon because the climate conditions, whether it's flooding, whether it's fires, whether it's heat, are not going to allow us to live there anymore. And I think we're gonna get to that point where we're going to have to make some hard decisions about cities and say, it's going to be too hot to live here. There's no way that we don't have the water resources to provide cooling. I mean, I'm thinking right now about Phoenix, which is a fairly wealthy city, and they're spraying, water out on diners to keep them cool, and thinking they can't really afford to be spraying that water there,
Yeah,
So
and you look at California, another example in the US, and then you look at the immense amount of money being poured into formerly arid areas in the Middle East, and wondering, is there a global rationale that justifies that, other than economic self-interest of each individual region or nation? So lots of, you're in a very interesting spot. If I were 30 years younger, I'd be next to you there. One quick question while we have a few more minutes, as well as is introducing something we haven't spoken about yet, but I know something that Good Joe is going to talk a lot about, which is housing. And how do you balance efforts to meet housing needs with sustainability goals and keep it all cost effective?
So meaning a trade-off between providing green infrastructure versus providing affordable housing?
Affordable housing, right? Which has typically been more high rise, right? More kind of using less land, perhaps not as high tech, if you will.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so I mean, if we think about the heat example again, we'll often have low-income residents living in very dense situations, in high rises, and they don't have air conditioning, and so are there ways that we can protect them from heat, from high temperatures? In some cases, it might be simple, low-cost things like providing education. So we talk about, not everybody knows how to manage heat. And don't open your windows during the day, open them at night and let the cold air in. During the day, you close the windows, you close the blinds, you close the drapes. So, even simple don't cook with your oven during the day when it's hot. Which sounds kind of obvious, but I mean, I think there are some things that we can do that are kind of low cost. But I mean, this is one of the things that when you look at, particularly at heat, is that low income residents tend to suffer the most from heat. They often have chronic illnesses that are exacerbated by heat as well. So we're seeing this real differentiation between who suffers from heat and who doesn't, just as an example. But your larger question about trade-offs between, providing low-income housing or providing green infrastructure, can we have both?
One would hope. All right, one last question because we have time. I know there are some financial types in this audience, including some investors who are always looking for what's the next best thing. So let me posture a little bit here, if you'll grant me that, and ask a very investor-focused question, which is delivering smart cities and delivering all this. It is going to require a fundamental retooling of the skill set of some pretty traditional industries. I know I live in an 18th century house here in Pennsylvania, and my chimney fell in, and I thought, great opportunity to upgrade my oil-fired heating system, right? I spoke to 17 HVAC contractors and couldn't get not one, who could actually do an analysis with me as to what my options were for moving into a greener energy system for my own home. So I think as you think about building resilient cities, you think about autonomous vehicles, you even think about smarter cars, traffic control, and all of that. The skill sets required to do that are fundamentally different. You're in an academic world, all three of you are, so I'm going to ask you all this question. How do we train our students better? What careers of the future are out there that we can encourage people to get involved in? And if I'm an investor, how do I think about helping to retool the last mile of infrastructure delivery from a human resources point of view?
I think this is a huge issue of upskilling and creating a workforce that can deal with, you know, kind of a high-tech digital landscape of cities of the future. If I was going to be glib about it, I would say let's just wait for 10 years and the robots are going to take over and they'll take care of us.
Let's hope not.
Let's hope not. We'll all just become robot polishers. But I'm not sure. But I do think we need to really think about. I mean, I think we're starting to develop systems that we don't really understand. And I think particularly municipal governments, particularly when we think about smart cities, when we think about artificial intelligence, we need a lot higher skill sets there. And I teach urban designers and urban planners, and I need to be teaching them, that they need to take these digital systems seriously. They don't necessarily need to know how to use them, or they don't need to know how to build them, but they need to know how they work. And so we're seeing, a lot more technical expertise, which was what cities were founded on expertise, technical expertise of engineers.
Absolutely.
And we're seeing new engineers come in, the ones that do information and communication technologies. And so we're seeing the re-engineering of cities today, and that includes, the skills of these engineers. And municipal governments cannot pay an engineer the same way that Google can pay that engineer. So
nor can they even write a spec to hire them, as we're finding out.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a huge issue.
Well, we could not have crafted a better introduction to what I know Jo is going to get very passionate about in a minute here, because I see her face. But thank you so much. I think you gave us some great insights and lots to think about, and you'll get another bite at the apple in a few minutes. So with that, I'm going to turn to a very intriguing woman to me. She sat as a former mayor of Liverpool, a city in London that most of us know from the Beatles, but also should know for many other things, including its ports and its very active urban landscape. And in addition to being mayor, she's had a lifelong interest in people and cities and urbanism. So if you wouldn't mind, Jo, could you tell us a little bit about how you got drawn into this field and what on earth made you decide to run for mayor?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can explain it well, to be fair. I've always been very passionate about equality. It was an accident, Laurie, but you did say a city in London, and of course we think we are the #1 city in the UK, not London. There's a famous joke where between London, people in London are asked who's the second city, and they say Manchester. Manchester say, well, Liverpool thinks London's the second city, and we think we're #1. But it does give an interesting insight into our personality. We were instrumental in, the slave triangle. So Liverpool was a fishing village before slavery.
Oh, interesting.
Not a lot of people sort of outside of Europe know that. And so our whole city, the wealth within our city is come from the slave trade. And, at one point we were fighting with New York to be the trade floor. And so the wealth of the city in history, going back in time, Liverpool in the 19th century was twice the population it is now. So we are very famous for the Beatles and for our football and for our attitudes, I think. But interesting to hear the debate around, growth of cities. We are 500,000 population for a city that was built for 1 million people. Obviously, we still have our infrastructure challenges, but trying to support people and tempt them into our city is been our strategy for a long time now. So we've been in sort of economic decline, of which we're slowly recovering from. A couple of decades ago, we were really fast growth, but at the moment, I think we sit 333 out of 336 local authorities in terms of deprivation, despite our fantastic tourism and our hospitality economy, which makes up nearly 50% of our economy. So
Wow.
Liverpool being a place as a port city in the past, all the things that you've talked about, we still have all those things going for us. I Throughout history as well, we've had black people here since the 1700s, so not really through Windrush and things like that. We've had black people here a long time. So we do have a lot of mixed race black people like myself who have a very strong identity and call ourselves Liverpool-born blacks. So when there was an opportunity to stand up for my city, despite me having the same name as the previous mayor, it felt a real privilege for me to represent my city and try and clear up a mess that had been made, but also to be this woman, black woman with a Scouse accent, representing our city on a global stage, felt very compelling to me. I only stood in for half a term, which I was delighted by, because actually I just wanted to help the city move along, because we were in political turmoil. My career has been focused on equality, diversity, and inclusion. So I had a sort of political upbringing when I was in my 20s, where I was sort of catapulted and fast-tracked into political life by the trade union movement, as the poster girl for equality, and felt it was very, a lot of lip service was being paid in the trade union movement, and I decided I didn't need to be a part of that. So I'd rejected politics for quite a long time. I was a local councillor in 2019, only to try and encourage other people to do it. I had planned on being there for a very short time. And with the previous mayor's arrest and the political turmoil and 3 women being taken off the shortlist, I had one foot in the camp and was far enough removed, I think, to be the right person for the job. And that's how I ended up there.
Interesting. Interesting. So putting on your former mayor hat for the moment, what is it about that you took away from the first 2 speakers' keynotes that you think will help all mayors? As you know, I think we've heard some very interesting things. Were there 1 or 2 that resonated with you from those 2 conversations?
Yeah, first of all, it's incredibly sad that we're not in Europe anymore. 60% of us Scousers voted to remain. So seeing a map that looked at the whole of Europe and we're missing from it was quite bizarre for me,
Yes.
because we still very much feel a part of Europe. But certainly in terms of heat, a very interesting, my understanding was our biggest risk was on from flood. We are on the waterfront, but there's no city in the UK that's built for heat at all. We're just not designed that way. When you go across cities across the world and how the streets are built for too much sun, and the streets are narrow. I went to Pompeii a few years ago and I was impressed by the design of the public square space for the young people to have. I mean, this is centuries ago, and it was designed better than we've slightly designed some of our cities. So that was a real learning for me around heat. I don't think we're equipped at all. We have done a focus on risk of flood. In terms of our housing stock, unusually Liverpool City Council don't own any housing stock. So 40% of our emissions are from housing stock that doesn't belong to us. So retrofitting our housing stock has been a real key priority. I think in terms of the earlier presentation around people moving to cities and moving away from cities, I don't think it's a fear for Liverpool. As I say, we're trying to get back to where we were in terms of doubling our population, but it's interesting how national government policy impacts. So, in the 90s, Labour concentrated on cities quite a bit, and then when the Tories took over, they concentrated on towns. And so it feels like there's a tension between cities and towns all the time, depending on
It's interesting,
who's
yeah.
in national government. And, certainly, I felt during my time as mayor, I felt we were completely ignored by national government. We weren't invited to COP. I can't remember what COP it was, but we weren't invited. Cities in the UK weren't invited to go and speak on the stage about climate change, about what to do, because it was government policy at the time to concentrate on towns rather than cities.
That's intriguing. And I think when we have our kind of group discussion at the end of this, I'd love to hear you and Eliza kind of chat that one out a little bit, because, I think that that the very strong penchant in the EU to have this kind of overarching planning framework very often does run headfirst into kind of local decision making.
Agenda,
And how do you resolve those issues,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And how do you provide continuity if you have no continuity at the top level? I think creates a massive roadblock for infrastructure of all kinds. We're certainly seeing that in the United States right now. We thought we had all these great laws and programs on the books, and they've all disappeared in the span of a month. And honestly, no one saw that coming. I say that facetiously. Some people did, but most people didn't. And so that kind of, when we'll have a session, our third webinar is going to be on governance, and I hope we really dig deep into this, because I think infrastructure is a long-term asset class. It takes a long time to plan it. I mean, the average infrastructure project, which I want to ask you about next, takes 20 years to plan. Some take 50 years to plan. It takes then a decade to build it, and hopefully they last for a half a century or more. So they're very long-term assets that don't do well under changing political flags. So you as mayor did have a couple of successes with some projects, and obviously there were projects that had been in the works, at least talked about before you got there. But I think it would be really enlightening if you could maybe walk us through a couple of your successful projects, and especially I think pointing out what you might do differently now, now that you've got a different perspective, and also maybe what groundwork was laid before you got involved that either made it work or made it difficult. Because I think maintaining this concept that infrastructure is a long-term asset class is just so important to get anything done.
Yeah. If I could have the next slide, please. So it's my first week in office. The city's in turmoil. It's got national commissioners in from government. The Labour group's in upheaval. Everyone's shouting, and we're losing our UNESCO World Heritage status because of Everton Football Stadium. And the previous mayor hadn't had a good relationship with UNESCO, hadn't treated them with respect. I tried everything, certainly cross-party. I had the previous leader of the city who is a Lib Dem and a Lord. I had a Tory MP, all working with me nationally, trying to convince UNESCO not to remove our World Heritage status. But they were determined, and Everton is on a dock that hasn't been used for over 40 years in an area of massive deprivation, and they wanted the design reduced in certain ways. And actually, what I knew from being a resident of the city, Everton engaged with communities like over 15 years on this new dock. It's in a area of massive deprivation that is so needed in terms of, the boost in the arm it gives to the local economy. So we just couldn't compromise. And I think some people thought we were tearing down our UNESCO buildings, which is couldn't be further from the truth. We have, as I say, as a result of slavery, we have lots of fantastic, high value, fantastic buildings that we live in. Our libraries are in there, our art galleries, our museums, we live in our UNESCO World Heritage status. So that was my first week in office, which I've got to say was a pretty tough one. But Everton is now completed. As I say, it wasn't my idea. It'd been in the pipeline for quite a long time. There was numerous problems, as you would imagine, on an infrastructure project of this big, and now it's completed. It's still not without its problems around parking and infrastructure and transport and everything else, but it's completed and it's beautiful and it's massive. And as you can read on the screen, it's going to create these jobs, the visitors that will come and visit Everton, and also a 1.3 million billion pounds estimated boost to the local economy. So if I had my time again, I wouldn't change that. I think we needed that. And I think UNESCO, in terms of our, well, I think they need to rethink what they've done rather than us need to rethink. I think, you know, despite, ongoing problems on the developments of this and the current problems the current leader has got, thankfully they're not mine, but everyone is quite up in arms over parking and transport at the moment. This has created a massive boost for the city that is necessary, and more to come, hopefully, with the surrounding area being a
And solving those
designated.
problems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was our first big infrastructure project that I wanted to talk about. And as I say, the deciding factor with me was how Everton had done it right, really engaging all those local communities and stakeholders and people about creating a future stadium that belonged to not just them but the city. And that's what I wasn't prepared to compromise on.
That's tremendous, and kudos to everyone involved. I mean,
yeah.
And 15 years is a short time.
Yes, and now it's finished. Even we're very competitive. Football's like religion in our city, but even the people who support Liverpool Football Club can't deny this is a beautiful thing.
I don't know if you need to be that confident, but okay. And what's your next project?
So the next project, let's have the next slide, please. So Paddington Village is an area. So as I said previously, our half of our economy is built on hospitality, and you can imagine during COVID, the impact that we felt when people couldn't visit and we couldn't do the things that we're good at in terms of having parties and having a good time. So again, way before my time and nothing to do with me, but our stakeholders in the city, the universities, the councils, the other stakeholders had gotten together and done a lot of testing during COVID. So we tested large events. We done that on behalf of the whole country. At one time, Liverpool and surrounding areas were able to remain not being in lockdown while the rest of the country had to go in lockdown. So we'd really developed this expertise around health and life sciences, and we'd set up a pandemic institute with the universities. Now, this building, the Spine building, is the healthiest building in the world or the country. I can't remember, but I remember my chief executive saying to me all the time, "It's the healthiest building." And in the end, I said, "How is that? How is it the healthiest building?" So the spec of the building is, as you walk in, the floor rug to take the dirt off your feet is longer. The furniture doesn't emit any toxins when you wash your hands. The temperature's just right when you look out the window away from your screen. Everything's perfect. So you literally end up cleverer when you leave this building because it's that good for your health. And actually, I've had a number of events there, and when you're speaking and you look out of the window, there's a calm and relaxation that happens. So I'm believing the hype on the healthiest building. But of course, this whole area we are trying to develop with our partners, private and public sector partners, universities, as well as the local council, into creating an economic boost to us around health and life sciences. That is our strategy in which we want to build. Obviously, hospitality is great, but they're low-paid jobs, and we want people to be on jobs of 40 or 50 pounds an hour. We have some of the best clinicians in the world working in Liverpool and surrounding areas because we have some of the worst health outcomes in the country. So this health and life science area, Paddington Village, we're trying to build our capacity there, not just for us as a city, but for the whole of the north of England.
I think Eliza will give you a gold star for that, because it's really demonstrating that the need to have multiple poles, right? That historically you were one thing, but it's been hollowed out. You need to create something else, something that someone else isn't doing. And that will indeed, you're creating jobs, you're creating reputation that will draw people in. And maybe we can come back to it, or you can spend another minute on it now. You're doing it with the inclusion of the private sector, which I may be biased, but in 50 years of doing this, the best projects in my mind have always been the ones that really had the full cooperation of the users, the government, and the private sector. They rarely go forward if they don't have all three.
Unfortunately, though, AstraZeneca were a main partner in this and had been promised a high sum from the previous government that they didn't get from this government and have pulled out, which is a bit disappointing.
Oh,
So
that's
whilst
too
I
bad.
do agree with you to some aspect, Laurie, relying on the private sector when there's other priorities for them,
Yeah.
that's proved problematic. But I'm sure we'll still be able to go ahead and find other partners to work on this.
Well, we wish you well on that.
Yeah.
And we can give you Melinda Gates's phone number.
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. And I think you've got one more project that you want to share with us before we run out
No,
of our assigned time here.
no, Laurie, that was it. I was just talking about them
Those
two
two. Okay,
projects.
great.
Yeah.
So I'm going to weave back into this something that I know you have spent much of your career thinking about, and it's something that this entire effort has really been founded on as we bring together the different communities through Vauban and Ultramind, through InfraVision, which is social engagement, social impact, inclusion, that the human side of infrastructure, of course, remains extremely important. So if you could maybe talk a little bit about how do you make sure that social engagement and social impact are brought into the process properly? And do you have any best practices that you can kind of recommend to us?
Yeah, we've built a lot of buildings in Liverpool that have started with the building and then have been a bit disappointed at the end of it when there's a famous quote, isn't it? Build it and they will come, and they haven't come. And so, starting from the building and the infrastructure without starting with the people who are going to participate or live, breathe, and be part of the building, I think is problematic. I think you have to do both at the same time. So looking at your end user and design and co-design structures that they want and need. I was brought up on a very poor housing estate, in the sense of poor and incredibly shoddy. It was an experiment, and I think it looked like a brutalist experiment, but it was made with materials that were, well, all the playground stuff for the children was made out of concrete, put it that way. There's lots of this in the UK. Just
Andy is
yeah,
shivering
yeah.
right now thinking about that.
None of us have got knees because our playgrounds were made out of the worst materials. But I grew up in a housing estate where crime was actually designed in. When I worked in Homes England for a little while, when it said people could just design crime out of an estate, I was like, oh, it was designed into my estate. You could commit a crime on one side of the estate and you could run undercover, for a couple of miles to the other
Before
side
they could ever find you.
where they could never find you. And it just shows you that, in building structures and infrastructure that people want and need, means that, when you get to the end of your infrastructure project, whether it be 10, 20 or 30 years, then you're building something that people want and it is built to last. And that's where you get the sustainability aspect. We have even made mistakes with the Paddington Village, in terms of we needed high end office space in order to attract businesses to the city, but we haven't been able to attract them because things changed during COVID, for example, where the people aren't looking at it in the same way. So I think you always have to start. And I think, we shouldn't be scared of communities and stakeholders and what they have to say to you. People get really nervous, but I've never met a group of people that once you describe the layers of complexity that is often within your decision making, that they don't understand, as long as you communicate with them a way that they understand. So being able to say, my hands are tied and this is the boundary that I've got to operate in. What's your take? What can you give to that? I find most people understand. So just not being fearful of talking. And our recent council in Liverpool have just made a massive mistake through a lack of communication, and all it required actually was to sit down and talk. So
Yeah.
I would suggest do that first.
And hopefully this effort of InfraVision will bring people into that. We would certainly welcome elected officials and politicians to join these webinars and begin the conversation. If we could unmute everybody on the who spoke this morning's screen, we're going to move into the Scrum.
Sorry, Laurie, I did have one more project. It was just worded a bit differently. Sorry, and if I could just have my slides back on.
Very quickly. You're
Yes,
out of
sorry,
time.
very quickly, I do apologise. We've been designated a Liverpool development zone by Everton, and the slide comes on in just a moment, where the national government has given us money to accelerate within this area. Yes, this is the zone.
Mhm.
So Liverpool Waters is going to be, sorry if we could
That
go
one.
back.
Yeah, that one. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember how many homes. I think it's 10,000 homes.
Mm.
Our market area, our fabric
Hmm.
district in thingy, Paddington Village that we've just mentioned, our music district in 10 streets, our office district in Pall Mall, and our train stations and
Yep.
our main
Where
gateway.
is the train station? Because that's my.
Upper Central, I think, is being called where the
Okay.
train station is.
Okay.
So,
Okay. Oh, yes. Yeah, there it
yeah.
is. Okay.
So in terms of the amount of money that's being developed, but also to accelerate any businesses and activity, particularly around health and tech. And, obviously we have a waterfront, we have a renewable strategy around making our waterfront able to be utilised for energy. But this Liverpool Strategic Development Zone, Accelerated Development Zone, is hopefully going to transform our city in a very short time. We've had these shovel-ready projects for years and years waiting on hand. So this
Excellent.
is a big shot in the arm for us in terms of investment from national government to try and accelerate some of our development. Thanks.
Perfect. All right. Well, that's actually a great lead into one of the things I think we want to talk about in the next 30 minutes or so. And we will end on time at 1. And we know people have, well, my 1, your cocktail hour. So if Andy and Eliza could unmute their buttons here and get ready to jump in. Let me start off with kind of a question that was asked on LinkedIn that I thought better belonged in this group than on an earlier one, which is really picking up on something you were saying, Eliza, which is going back to what Andy was talking about autonomous vehicles, but many of the cities and areas that have been trying to change mobility to make it less car-centric are seeing massive public backlash against that, right? At least in the early stages of implementation. And the questioner asked, what are examples of best practice to make these new mobility practices more acceptable to the public? I'm going to broaden that to the larger question of change is difficult in any collective environment. And you were just talking, Joe, about the fact that you have to get the social license to operate. You have to basically communicate. But Andy and Eliza, I'd love you to pick up on this thought for a moment about how do you kind of get people to begin to open their mind and to be more adaptive to changing technologies and stuff? Are there best practices, or is it just simply communication, as Joe said? And whoever wants to go first, go for it.
Well, don't know. Andy, me?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Andy.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think as Joe said, I think, communication is key and getting buy-in from people. It can be about carrots and sticks. Nobody wants a congestion charge. So you have to give them something positive to what's the benefits of having a congestion charge. And we've seen the struggles. We don't see a lot of congestion charging that's happening, but it can be a really powerful tool for dealing with traffic. So I think a lot of it is about scripting a narrative that can really show an improved future for everybody and not just benefit some people. But it's tough. A lot of people don't want to change. And sometimes I've been really interested in this idea of infrastructure destabilization, and this idea that you take things away. So you'll take away a freeway that cuts through a city. You'll take away on-street parking. People don't like that so much.
Right.
But then when they see the results, then like, oh, I can see what this is. So sometimes we'll see where they'll do temporary uses. So I'm doing a project in Stockholm where we're looking at summer streets, where they take away the car parking during the summer. They put in benches, they put in stages, they have programs and things that happen. And so you start to ease people into this. This is how we could have streets. And it doesn't always lead to, complete changes to the mobility system. But, so you can kind of experiment with some things and open some minds, but also start to have a conversation. What do you think about this? Is this working? What are the downsides of this? And there's always going to be, it's always political. There's always going to be winners and losers, whether it's business owners that want people to park outside of their restaurant, or whether it's the residents that don't want people partying until 2 a.m, right under their window. So I mean, there's trade-offs, but I mean that's what cities are dynamic because of that. There's all these frictions that happen, but so.
No, I think that's a very good point. Eliza, I know you kind of sit at this at a higher level, but do you have anything to add to that?
No, yes, I think this is a very important question, because in fact, how do people adapt to new technologies, to new ways of doing things? And I think there is one of these big trends that I think we have got to bring into the picture. Then this is aging as well. Aging and digital exclusion, because not everybody feels at ease with the new technologies. Then there is another aspect, that is the perception of risk. Of course, everybody was using, LinkedIn and internet and Facebook, and all of a sudden you say, but what am I playing with? And the last aspect that I think is important to put into picture is the feeling of losing control on your own decisions, because okay, you can rely on public transport, but what if there is a strike? What if you need to go and the thing is not there? So I mean, there is this adaptation that is not easy all the time, but there are extra elements in this. Having said this, there was, I think, even if we have this vision for the future in a lot of countries, I think there is a lot of investment going on in public transport. Not the usual public transport. Of course, people put buses, and it is electrical buses. They have probably a better management of the bus system, because in a lot of places across Europe, it is not also viable economically, and we have got also to analyze the sustainability of what we do from a perspective of the cost efficiency of the issue. So a railway is something, or a metro is a very expensive infrastructure. So you need public transport. So for time being, we were in my recent life, we are financing a lot of changes in areas, in urban areas, in middle-sized cities. They were refitting the whole set of buses and the other public transport means, putting them in a more sustainable way. So, but they were still investing in that. I would also like to make a comment, if you allow me, Laurie, about this issue of the public infrastructures and of the governance of the public infrastructures. I find this absolutely essential. And Andy mentioned this, and I'd like really to hear more about how, because if you want to build a good transport system in a metropolitan area, you have to deal very often with a lot of constituencies.
Yes.
So they don't match often. So how do the governance of that structure? But if
we have our entire last webinar is on that topic.
Yeah,
so make sure you come.
Yeah, I
think that's right. I think it is a very and of course that is going to be different country by country, region by region, how you do.
That's also why.
But I think it is a fascinating conversation to be had.
Yeah,
yes.
That's also why. I mean, when you talk about long-term infrastructures, and you were absolutely right when you mentioned it, the cohesion funds, they have a 7-year period. And the initial idea was exactly to make sure that at least the leading forces would agree on what is unquestionable for the country. Because the truth is, and you were asking about the financial viability of these projects, and I was mentioning also before that for these big structural solutions, you need a certain stability, but you also need some grants. if you don't do the grants. And of course, there is a very important business in building these infrastructures, because they are guaranteed by funding, public funding and cohesion funding. But then there is another business activity, that is the management of these infrastructures in the best and more efficient way. And this goes for metros, this goes for water supplies, this goes
Absolutely.
for
It's kind of what Andy and I started talking about, right? Which is the workforce of the future, and how do you develop a workforce that can handle all of this change and manage these more sophisticated systems?
Yeah,
absolutely.
But also it shouldn't. It might be just relevant in the UK, but these decisions should be non-partisan. They shouldn't be
absolutely
politically motivated by certain governments.
Of course.
Because it just ends up a fight between them. But our issues around climate change, our big infrastructure projects that are necessary for all our cities to grow, shouldn't be sort of at the mercy of political.
Yes, we must decide where we agree and where we disagree. But where you agree, you have got to produce it and to deliver it. That's for sure.
So we have a very interesting question, and it's a great question to land on. And I'd like you each to take a shot at this question. We'll start with Joe, which is kind of I know it's hard to think about the future, but what do you think the most plausible scenarios are for how cities will evolve over the next 20 to 30 years? Do you think future cities will rely more on large-scale infrastructure projects as engines of growth, or on more modular, adaptive systems? And if possible, and if you'd like to, can you share 2 or 3 recommendations for local officials and policymakers to make all this happen? Let's start with Joe, if we will, and then we'll do Eliza, and we'll let Andy have the last word on this, because he's probably got 10,000 statistics to share with us.
So it's interesting. I get asked to talk a lot on cities, and as a Black woman, one of my priorities is safety within city. You know, I want a city that's designed where I can walk about at night.
Not just Black women, honey.
Yeah. But I'm not, I'm not going to be racially attacked. And, safety is an important element for me about where I live, and I'm definitely a city girl. Not only do I like to live in a city, I like to visit cities. So having a city that is safe, and for me to move about, it needs to be people-centered. So I'm not really concerned about in which way we go about that, whether it's big infrastructure or it's a modular system. But I'd like to be my needs, as I age, as people have kids, I'd like for people to be the focus of progression and movement within cities. And I just think we're not moving fast enough on climate change. We're just not. I don't see enough. We've got some good infrastructure being put in place now around cycling, for example. That was just given it was thrown up during COVID. It was, bike lanes that were dangerous and stuff like that. So I think, prioritizing people and climate in how our cities progress. That's my advice to policymakers, because, our cities for the future need to be not just safe, I suppose, physically, but we have to be safe environmentally as well.
That's well said. Well said. Eliza?
Well, this is an interesting question and difficult one, because I think we still have to build large-scale infrastructures if the city is already big enough, and it's suffering from a disconnection in terms of costs of transport, costs of housing, pockets of instability, pockets of poverty. But the way to manage this, although I agree that for water supply, for the management of metro systems, you still need a structure, a big structure, or a big management capacity. More and more cities tend to create nucleus inside the city where you feel a more human dimension. And so I think the future will have to be so that people feel human inside the city, and we see experiments that were done in a lot of big metropolises, like in Paris, where you tend to create all the amenities in a smaller scale, so that people feel that they are inside a section where you have a human dimension. Also, there is a big discussion that it's also interesting if you should allow big supermarkets and big trade chains inside city, or if you should protect the small shops and the local fairs during weekends or on special days, because this gives you a human flavor, and also it creates a sense of security that otherwise you start not feeling. I saw some projects in which, for instance, you develop a special program for the city during the night. I've not visited recently Liverpool. I don't know if you have developed it, but there are programs like that in which you create a program to keep some sort of to do. I mean, a light system that gives you a sense of comfort and that reduces the scale so that you feel that it is human. But I think in certain big conurbations, you cannot give away from building some infrastructures that are forced by need and sometimes not anymore by option. But I think the future, if you look at the more developed countries in Europe and the more performing economies, which are basically the Nordic ones, we can get some inspiration from those models, and they are basically a multipolar kind of system and not this massive congestion. At least in the European system, I favor this one, the multipolar.
Okay. Okay. Any recommendations for local officials? And I'm specifically calling that out to you because you do tend to operate on a more EU level, but what do you see bubbling up from the local side that you either wish you could change or wish you could encourage?
I think the social aspect needs very special attention, and also in that respect, I saw wonderful examples in which you follow a family, you follow you create a system, and you can finance that through also European support. I'm sorry about it, but it's grants for social housing. And one of the interesting things is to create social housing, not in a kind of a separated segment of the city, but rather, and this is a model that in certain cities, they started in the 60s, so a long time ago, and it worked, having very sophisticated areas and side by side with
infill,
with the same schools, with the same streets, because people integrate rather than creating a kind of ghettos where everybody that is in social housing has to live. There are other examples, and I think it's worth referring to them, of certain municipalities hiring flats, apartments, and giving them to people that are cannot afford to have another one. But also, it is important to train people to follow and monitor people so that they can actually integrate, because we have mixed situations across Europe, and sometimes this integration, if it is not managed with the adequate methodologies, doesn't work. And this happens with minorities, for instance, like Roma people, that particularly in certain Eastern countries, they are very isolated. And we're working on methodologies to bring children. I think children are really a game changer if they are educated, if they are cared for, if they are trained. They can make a huge change in their families and in their societies. And I think this is really something to work for, to create cities on which you can grow a family, trying also to counter this massive demographic winter in which we are falling in Europe, because people are aging. And the other aspect is to create good conditions for elderly people that really are very, very affected by safety, but also by the environment where they can go on being active without having an overperception of risk or an isolation, which is really very bad. So it's a mixture of policies
Excellent.
that
That's
go
terrific.
very narrow to the very narrow housing where they are, the place,
Mm-hmm.
the square where they meet, the support they can have.
It sounds
And
like
there
you
are
and
very
Joe.
good examples.
Sounds like you and Joe have a fairly similar vision of what's important. Not to forget that cities are for people, not the other way around.
So we are not walking alone. That's good.
And they need to be, exactly. Andy, I think you've got almost the last word on this. So what are your thoughts? Where are we going to be in 20 or 30 years? And what are your messages for local officials?
Yes. So big question. Let me give you two scenarios. One's the dystopian 20 or 30 years in the future. I think what we're seeing now, and we've seen for the past 10 years, maybe 15 years, is this eclipse of the state, or the state having less power, having less finance, less ability to do things. And therefore, they've turned into kind of short-termism. They don't have the ability, they don't have the resources to really think, how can we do these long-term, huge infrastructure projects? Instead, they're thinking about, how are we going to get through tomorrow? How are we going to get through next week? And so there's been a real emphasis on doing a lot of small little modular things and hoping that 1,000 flowers bloom and everything will turn out okay. I think what that's going to result in is very highly uneven urban landscapes, where you're going to have some neighborhoods, some blocks, some buildings that are doing really well, and other ones that are doing really poorly. So I don't think that's the way to go. So if we turn to sort of more utopian future, it would be more about, return of the state, return of this sort of civic power to rise above and to create these big infrastructure projects. We've been riding on our infrastructure systems now for over 100 years. We've seen some upgrades, but you can go back and look at pictures from 50 years ago, 75 years ago. Hasn't changed a whole lot. And a lot of these systems, whether it's housing, whether it's water, whether it's energy, they're starting to break down, and all we're doing is maintaining them. And so to think about climate change, to think about all these changes that are happening and reinventing those networks is going to take a ton of money. But at the same time, it's something that's really necessary. So to think about, are there ways that we can really kind of think big? So what I would tell policymakers and politicians, I know that you have less power now. I know you've got a more divided constituency, but think big, and come up with some big things that you can do. Maybe they're not big cost things. I mean, if we look at Paris and we look at the way that they responded to COVID, and if you've been to Paris recently, it's become a cycling city. It's really, it's really amazing. And some of the stuff was they had to spend money on, but some of it was just, we're going to take out car parking here and we're going to put in cycle lanes. Or if you look at Barcelona and their idea about super blocks, that doesn't have to be expensive either. So, I mean, I think there's ways to think creatively and do things that have big impacts, but maybe they don't have big costs associated with them.
I think that's thank you, all of you. And I think I'm going to draw from that encouragement. It's, sometimes when I think about the future of cities and I go to cities, I get very discouraged because, they do look the same as they looked when I first went there 50 years ago, and not much has changed. And I think there's still the same graffiti on the same subway car sometimes. And but then other times, you get very energized. I drove into New York the other day, and the first time I've driven in since congestion pricing has been in effect. And it took 45 minutes off my trip. Because I'd come in the west side and I had to go to the east side. And normally that would be an hour once you got into Manhattan. And it literally took 15 minutes. It was phenomenal. So it's like, wow, that is a massive change. And now to hear the business community, which hated the idea of congestion pricing, now liking it and fighting for its retention, it's very interesting, because it says to all of us, right, that a little bit of success, if you just kind of persevere sometimes, that support you were looking for all along may actually all of a sudden show up. So if I get to add my voice to this, to local officials, it's perseverance. When I started out as a urban planner, I worked for New Jersey Transit, which had just taken over all the bankrupt private train and rail operations in the state of New Jersey, and they had governmentized them because they'd all gone bankrupt. Now we're privatizing everything, right? But then they'd already all gone bankrupt, so we took them over. And we started planning on a number of projects. And one of them was a new rail tunnel into Penn Station, New York, from New Jersey, because the old tunnel had passed its useful life and was ready to fail any minute. It almost did fail during Superstorm Sandy. They were literally one high tide away from losing the only rail connection into Manhattan, if you can imagine that. Just 2 months ago, I went to a groundbreaking ceremony where the TBM went underground. I worked on that project in 1976. So the other thing I have for local officials is don't give up. Certain things are essential and need to happen, but unfortunately the time is not always right, and you have to just kind of keep plugging away and plugging away and plugging away. And then I think the last thing that I would add is good ideas come from everywhere. And I think there are some amazing urban developments in Latin America. There's some amazing things to be learned, even in China. We may not love what those cities look like, but there are more 20 million plus cities in China than anywhere else on the face of the earth, and they work. And there are lessons to be derived from that. So I think my encouragement to this group is to take those trips, take those lessons. You know, if you're a developer and a contractor, sponsor the city officials to go see your project in Lima, because they'll learn something. And I think the fundamental thing we've all said today is communication is really what's going to drive all of this. Being able to explain what's needed, to justify it, to win support, and then to just constantly get that message across, I think is really why we're doing this, why you guys do what you do. And on behalf of Altermind and Vauban, I want to thank you for your participation, panelists and audience. It's weird not to have any sense of who's in the audience, but I guess that will change soon. And the next one of these sessions is going to be an in-person session in Paris. It will be a breakfast. I don't believe the date of that has been announced yet, but we also have more podcasts coming up. We will have one in May and one in June, and I will be moderating all of those. And I look forward to seeing familiar faces on this end and hopefully some more good conversation. So thank you all very much for participating. And ding dong, the cocktail bell has rung. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.